The afternoon light comes through the nursing home windows in those amber slants that photographers call golden hour. And Rachel Bennett stands beside the bed of a dying man whose hands are folded across his chest with the kind of stillness that suggests he has already begun the process of letting go, even though his lungs still draw air and his heart still beats with the stubborn persistence of a body that does not yet understand it is time to stop. The ring on his left hand catches the light and throws small rainbows across the white hospital linens, and Rachel finds herself staring at it with the kind of attention that comes from exhaustion and too many double shifts and the slow accumulation of debts that never stop growing, no matter how many hours she works, or how carefully she budgets, or how many small luxuries she eliminates from a life that was never luxurious to begin with. The ring is platinum, with a diamond so large it seems obscene in this place where people come to die with dignity that insurance barely covers. And Rachel thinks about what a ring like that could do for her daughter's college fund, for the medical bills from her own mother's cancer treatment that are still arriving 2 years after the funeral, for the car that keeps breaking down, and the apartment lease that is coming up for renewal with a rent increase she cannot afford. The man in the bed is named William Harrington, and he has been a patient at Mercy View Nursing Home for 6 months. And in that time, Rachel has learned that he is 87 years old and has no living relatives and made his fortune in commercial real estate during the boom years when cities were sprawling outward and strip malls were being built on every piece of farmland that could be purchased and paved. She has learned that he is kind in the distracted way that wealthy people are sometimes kind when kindness costs them nothing, that he tips well at Christmas and remembers the names of staff members and says please and thank you with the automatic, courtesy of someone who was raised in a generation that valued manners even when it did not always value the people being addressed. She has learned that he sleeps poorly and prefers his room cold and likes to have the television on even when he is not watching it, because silence makes him anxious in ways he cannot articulate, but that Rachel understands because she also finds silence oppressive when it gives her too much space to think about everything that is wrong. What she has not learned until today is that William Harrington is dying imminently rather than eventually, that the doctor has given him perhaps 48 hours before his organs begin the cascade failure that will end a life that has already been mostly ended by strokes and dementia, and the slow erosion of selfhood that happens when memory becomes unreliable and the present keeps slipping into a past that is equally unreachable. The doctor told Rachel this during rounds while standing in the hallway outside William's room, told her with the clinical efficiency of someone who delivers death sentences regularly enough that emotion would be unsustainable, told her that she should call the hospice coordinator and make William comfortable and ensure that his final hours are as peaceful as circumstances allow. Rachel nodded and made notes on her chart and did not mention that making someone comfortable when they are dying is a euphemism for a process that is neither comfortable nor peaceful, but rather involves managing pain and confusion and the indignity of a body that is shutting down in ways that no amount of morphine can make graceful. She adjusts William's blankets, even though they do not need adjusting, because doing something with her hands makes standing in a room with a dying man feel less like waiting for death and more like providing care. And she notices again the ring that has been on his finger for as long as she has known him, notices the way it catches light and seems to pulse with value, that feels almost aggressive in its contrast to the institutional beige walls and the generic landscape prints, and the medical equipment that beeps and hums with mechanical indifference. William's eyes are closed, but she knows he is not sleeping, because his breathing has the irregular quality of someone who is hovering in that space between consciousness and unconsciousness, where pain medication and organ failure create a kind of twilight awareness that is neither rest nor wakefulness. The ring is loose on his finger because he has lost weight during his time at Mercy View, has lost the subcutaneous fat and muscle mass that happens when eating becomes difficult and the body begins consuming itself for fuel. And Rachel thinks about how easy it would be to slide that ring off his finger right now while he is too sedated to notice or object. How simple it would be to pocket it and walk out of this room and out of this nursing home and into a future where her daughter, Grace, could go to the college she wants instead of the community college that is all Rachel can afford, where the medical debt could be paid and the car could be fixed and the apartment lease could be signed without the terror of wondering whether next month's paycheck will cover rent and groceries simultaneously. The thought arrives with such clarity that it feels less like temptation and more like recognition of a solution that has been obvious all along. Feels like the universe presenting an opportunity that would be foolish to refuse when opportunities are so rare and consequences are so constant. Rachel has been a nurse for 12 years and has never stolen anything from a patient, has prided herself on being someone who maintains professional ethics even when ethics are expensive, has believed that integrity matters more than immediate relief from financial pressure. But integrity has not paid her bills or secured her daughter's future or prevented the accumulation of debt that makes every month feel like drowning in slow motion. And she is tired of being good in ways that cost her everything, while people like William Harrington wear rings worth more than she will earn in 5 years of wiping bodies and distributing medications, and pretending that dying with dignity is possible when dignity requires resources that Medicaid does not provide. She reaches for the ring before she can talk herself out of it, reaches with hands that are steady despite the hammering of her heart, reaches with the practical efficiency of someone performing a medical procedure rather than committing theft. The platinum band slides off William's finger with the smoothness of inevitability, and Rachel closes her fist around it and feels the weight of it and the warmth of it from his body heat. And she thinks about how this single object represents more security than she has ever possessed, represents the difference between survival and stability, represents a future where she is not constantly calculating whether she can afford to eat lunch or whether that money needs to be saved for Grace's school supplies. Before you judge what Rachel just did, before you decide whether desperation justifies theft or whether poverty excuses breaking trust, I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because what Happens Next will completely destroy everything you think you know about wealth and poverty, and the stories we tell ourselves about who deserves what. Now tell me this, if you were drowning in debt and had a daughter depending on you, and you saw a way out that would hurt no one because the man who owned the ring was dying and had no family to inherit it, would you take it, or would you let the opportunity pass? Leave your answer in the comments, because Rachel's choice in the next 3 days will reveal truths that will shatter her understanding of everything. Rachel slips the ring into the pocket of her scrubs and finishes her shift with the mechanical efficiency of someone going through motions while their mind is elsewhere. And she drives home in the car that makes concerning noises when she accelerates, and parks in front of the apartment building that has needed exterior paint for 3 years, and climbs the stairs to the 3rd floor where Grace is doing homework at the kitchen table that wobbles because one leg is shorter than the others. Grace is 14 years old and has her mother's dark hair and her father's height, and an intelligence that terrifies Rachel, because intelligence requires opportunity to flourish, and opportunity requires money that Rachel does not have. And she watches her daughter solve algebra problems with the focused intensity of someone who believes that education is the path out of poverty. Even though Rachel knows that education without resources is just another form of hope that reality will eventually crush. Grace looks up when Rachel enters and asks how her day was, with the automatic concern of a child who has learned to monitor her mother's emotional state, because emotional state determines whether dinner will be mac and cheese from a box or something. That requires more energy than Rachel currently possesses. And Rachel tells her it was fine, with the automatic lie of a mother who has learned to shield her daughter from the weight of adult problems. She makes dinner and they eat while watching a television show about people renovating houses in ways that cost more money than Rachel will earn in her lifetime. And Rachel thinks about the ring in her pocket and about what she will do with it tomorrow, when she has time to think clearly about logistics and consequences, and whether selling stolen jewelry is something she is actually capable of doing, or whether the fantasy of having done it is as far as this impulse will carry her. That night, Rachel lies in bed and thinks about William Harrington dying alone in his room at Mercy View. Thinks about whether he has noticed the ring is missing, or whether his awareness is too compromised to register the absence of something that has been on his finger for longer than Rachel has been alive. She thinks about his wife, who must have given him that ring decades ago, about whether she is dead or divorced or simply estranged, about what stories that ring could tell about love and commitment and the promises people make when they believe forever is possible. She thinks about Grace sleeping in the next room and about the college applications that will be due in 4 years, and about the scholarship essays that will need to be written, and about the fact that even with scholarships, the cost of higher education is designed to keep people like Grace in the same economic class as their parents, designed to ensure that mobility is myth rather than reality. She thinks about her own mother, who died drowning in medical debt because cancer treatment in America costs more than most people earn in a lifetime, who spent her final months worried about whether the bills would destroy Rachel's future, the way the disease was destroying her body, who made Rachel promise that she would not let money prevent Grace from having opportunities that Rachel herself never had. She thinks about that promise and about whether stealing a ring from a dying man is breaking a different promise or keeping the one that matters more. And she does not sleep because sleep requires a clear conscience, and her conscience is currently occupied with justifications and rationalizations and the desperate mathematics of survival. The next morning, Rachel returns to work and checks on William Harrington first thing. And he is still alive, but more diminished than yesterday, more absent from his own body. And his left hand is still folded across his chest, but now without the ring that has marked it for decades. She waits for him to mention the missing ring, waits for him to ask where it went or to accuse her of taking it. But he says nothing because he's beyond saying anything. Is in that final phase where consciousness is sporadic and speech is impossible, and the body is simply running out the clock on biological processes that no longer serve any purpose. Rachel performs her duties with the automatic efficiency of muscle memory and tells herself that William will be dead by tomorrow and will never know the ring is gone. That taking something from someone who is dying is different from taking something from someone who is living, because the dead have no use for possessions and the living have infinite use for resources. She's changing his IV when his eyes open and focus on her with the sudden clarity that sometimes happens when the dying rally briefly before the final decline. And he looks at her with recognition that feels like accusation, even though he says nothing. And Rachel feels her heart accelerate because she is certain he knows, certain he can see the theft written on her face, certain that this moment of lucidity is going to result in her being fired and possibly prosecuted and losing everything. But William just looks at her and his lips move slightly as if he is trying to speak. And Rachel leans closer to hear him, even though she's terrified of what he might say. And his voice, when it comes, is barely a whisper, and the words are just her name, just Rachel, spoken with effort that suggests this is important, even though he lacks the strength to explain why it is important. She tells him to rest and not try to talk, and that she will take care of everything. And his eyes close again, and his breathing settles back into the irregular rhythm of someone whose autonomic nervous system is slowly losing its coordination. And Rachel finishes her shift and drives to a pawn shop on the other side of town, where she has never been, but that she researched online during her lunch break. The pawn shop is exactly as depressing as she imagined it would be, is full of the discarded possessions of people who needed money more than they needed the objects that once had sentimental value. And the man behind the counter has the weary cynicism of someone who has heard every hard luck story and believes none of them. Rachel places the ring on the glass counter and tells the man she needs to sell it, and he examines it with a jeweler's loupe and asks her where she got it with the practiced suspicion of someone who deals with stolen goods regularly enough to know the patterns. Rachel tells him it belonged to her grandmother, which is a lie that feels less offensive than the truth. And the man looks at her in a way that suggests he knows it is a lie, but does not care enough to press the issue. And he tells her he can give her $8,000 for it, which is so much less than the ring is worth that Rachel feels her breath catch. Because she knows the ring is worth at least $50,000 and probably more. But she also knows that pawn shops do not pay fair value, and that arguing will only create suspicion she cannot afford. She accepts the $8,000 because $8,000 is still more money than she has ever possessed at one time, is still enough to make a meaningful difference, even though it is a fraction of what William Harrington's ring is actually worth. And she walks out of the pawn shop with cash in her purse and guilt in her chest, and the growing awareness that she has just done something that cannot be undone. She deposits the money in her checking account and watches her balance transform from negative to positive for the first time in years. And she thinks about paying off the credit cards and fixing the car and putting money into Grace's college fund. And she tries to feel relief. But what she actually feels is a hollowness that suggests the price of this money is higher than the amount she paid. That evening, Grace notices that Rachel seems distracted and asks if everything is okay. And Rachel tells her that work has been stressful, which is true even though it is not the whole truth. And Grace tells her that she got an A on her algebra test, and her teacher said she should consider applying to advanced math programs. And Rachel feels pride and terror in equal measure because advanced programs cost money and require resources, and assume a level of economic stability that Rachel has never had and may never have despite the $8,000 currently sitting in her account. She thinks about telling Grace that money is no longer a problem, that the advanced programs are now possible, that the future Rachel has been promising but could not deliver is suddenly achievable. But she does not tell her any of this because explaining where the money came from would require admitting what she did, and she is not ready to see her daughter's opinion of her change from respect to disappointment. The next morning, Rachel goes to work, knowing that William Harrington will almost certainly be dead because 48 hours have passed since the doctor gave his timeline. And she approaches his room with the strange combination of relief and dread that comes from knowing that his death will eliminate the witness to her theft, but will also finalize her transformation from nurse who maintains ethical standards to person who steals from dying patients. She pushes open the door, expecting to find William's body being prepared for the funeral home, but instead, she finds William awake and sitting up in bed with a clarity in his eyes that should not be possible given his prognosis. And he looks at her and tells her that he needs to talk to her about something important, and that she should close the door and sit down because what he has to say will take some time. Rachel closes the door with hands that have started shaking because she is certain this is the confrontation she has been dreading, certain that William is about to accuse her of theft and demand the ring back and call security and destroy the fragile stability she has just purchased with his property. But William does not mention the ring. Instead, he tells her that he has been aware of his surroundings more than people realize. That dementia and dying do not always mean complete absence of consciousness. That he has been watching her for months and has seen the way she works twice as hard as the other, nurses and treats patients with genuine kindness rather than professional obligation, and goes home exhausted every day to a daughter who deserves better than the life Rachel can currently provide. He tells her that he knows she took his ring and that he knows why she took it. And Rachel starts to speak, but he holds up his hand to stop her and tells her that he is not angry and is not going to report her, and in fact wanted her to take it because he has been trying to figure out how to help her without making the help feel like charity. And the ring was his solution, even though the execution was more passive than he intended, because dying makes active planning difficult. Rachel stares at him, trying to process what he is telling her, trying to understand whether this is real or whether William's dementia has created a confusion where he thinks he intended something that actually happened through her theft. And she tells him that she does not understand, that she stole from him and he should be calling the police, not telling her he wanted her to have it. William tells her that the ring was his wife's engagement ring and his mother's before that it has been in his family for 3 generations and represents love and commitment and the kind of legacy that matters more than money, but that he has no children to pass it to and no relatives who would value it for anything except its monetary worth. And he has spent months watching Rachel struggle and thinking about what happens to his possessions when he dies, and realizing that giving the ring to someone who needs it is better than letting it go to the state or to some distant cousin who never visited him. He tells her that he put the ring on loosely, deliberately, that he stayed still when she took it because he wanted her to take it, that the whole thing was his attempt at generosity, even though it was complicated by his inability to communicate clearly what he intended. Rachel tells him that she sold it already, that she went to a pawn shop and got $8,000, which is nowhere near what it is worth, and William looks disappointed but not surprised, and tells her that pawn shops are thieves who prey on desperate people, but that $8,000 is still meaningful money when you have none. He tells her that he wishes she had waited because he was planning to tell her today that the ring was hers and that she should sell it properly to a jeweler who would pay fair value, but that he understands desperation does not wait for permission or optimal timing. He tells her that what matters is not the money, but what she does with it, that he has spent his life accumulating wealth that brought him no happiness because he confused having money with having purpose. And he wants her to use the ring money to create purpose for Grace in ways that his own wealth never created purpose for him. Rachel is crying now because she does not understand how to process this information, does not know whether to feel gratitude or shame or confusion about a situation where her theft was apparently not theft, but rather a gift that she misunderstood. And William tells her that she should feel neither guilty nor grateful, because what happened was messy and imperfect, but ultimately resulted in her having resources she needed and him having the satisfaction of helping someone before he died. He tells her that he has one more thing to give her, and he gestures toward the nightstand where there is an envelope with her name written on it in shaky handwriting that suggests significant effort. Rachel opens the envelope, and inside is a letter and a business card. And the letter explains that William has revised his will to leave his entire estate to Rachel Bennett, with the instructions that she use the money to ensure her daughter receives the education and opportunities that will allow her to contribute meaningfully to the world. And the business card belongs to William's attorney, who has been instructed to contact Rachel after William's death to facilitate the estate transfer. The letter explains that William's estate is worth approximately $4 million after taxes and legal fees, that this money represents a lifetime of work that brought him wealth but not family, and that he wants Rachel to have it not because She took his ring, but because she is someone who values family above wealth and will use resources to create meaning rather than simply accumulate more resources. Rachel reads the letter twice, trying to understand if this is real, trying to process that her theft, which was not actually theft, has somehow resulted in inheriting $4 million from a dying man she barely knows. And she looks at William, who is watching her with the tired satisfaction of someone who has completed a difficult task and can now rest. She tells him she cannot accept this, that it is too much, that she does not deserve it, and William tells her that deserve is the wrong framework, that the question is not whether she deserves wealth, but whether she will use wealth to create good. And he believes, based on months of observation, that she will use it exactly as he hopes, which is to give her daughter opportunities, and to remember that money is only valuable when it serves purposes beyond its own accumulation. He tells her that he is tired now and needs to sleep, and Rachel sits beside his bed and holds his hand, which no longer has the ring, but still has the indentation where the ring used to be. And she watches him drift into sleep. That might be sleep, or might be the beginning of the final decline that the doctor predicted. She sits there for an hour thinking about everything that has happened in the past 3 days, thinking about how her theft was actually a gift, and how her guilt is now complicated by gratitude, and how her understanding of William Harrington has transformed from wealthy stranger to unlikely benefactor, who has given her daughter's future with the same casualness that other people give tips. What Rachel does not know yet is that William's will is more complicated than the letter suggests, that there are conditions attached to the inheritance that will require her to make choices about how she uses the money, that William's generosity, who comes with expectations that will test whether she actually values family above wealth, or whether having wealth will transform her the way it transformed William into someone who died alone despite having millions. She does not know that William's attorney is someone who knew William well, and who has instructions to evaluate whether Rachel is truly the person William believed her to be, or whether poverty has made her desperate enough that sudden wealth will corrupt her character in ways that will make her unrecognizable to herself. And she does not know that in the envelope there is also a second document that she has not yet discovered, a document that contains information about William's life that will change everything she thinks she understands about who he was and why he chose her and what he expects her to do with his fortune. William Harrington dies 3 days later in the early hours of morning, when the nursing home is quiet except for the mechanical sounds of equipment and the soft footsteps of night shift nurses making their rounds. And Rachel is not there when it happens, because she is at home sleeping the dreamless sleep of someone whose exhaustion has finally exceeded her anxiety. And she wakes to a phone call from her supervisor telling her that William passed peacefully and that his body has been transported to the funeral home, and that Rachel should take the day off, because losing a patient you have cared for is always difficult, even when the death was expected and arguably merciful. Rachel lies in bed after the call ends and thinks about the last time she saw William alive, about how he looked at her with understanding that felt almost paternal, about how his final gift has transformed her financial reality in ways she is still struggling to process, and she feels grief that is complicated by gratitude and guilt, and the awareness that she is mourning someone she barely knew, but who knew her better than she realized. She gets out of bed and retrieves the envelope from where she has hidden it in her closet beneath winter sweaters that she rarely needs in a climate that stays mild most of the year. And she reads William's letter again, looking for details she might have missed in her initial shock, and this time she notices that the envelope feels thicker than a single letter, and business card should make it feel. And she looks inside more carefully and discovers a second document folded and tucked into a pocket she had not noticed before. The document is a contract printed on heavy legal paper with William's signature at the bottom and spaces for her signature and the attorney's signature, and the heading reads, "Terms and Conditions of Inheritance," with the kind of formal language that suggests serious legal implications and binding obligations. Rachel reads the contract with growing apprehension as she realizes that William's $4 million estate is not an unconditional gift, but rather comes with requirements that she must fulfill, or the inheritance will be forfeited and donated to charity instead. The first condition is that Rachel must use at least half of the inheritance specifically for Grace's education, including college and graduate school if Grace chooses to pursue it. And this condition feels reasonable and actually aligns with what Rachel would have done anyway. But the second condition is more complicated and requires that Rachel work as a nurse for at least 5 more years before using any of the money for personal expenses beyond basic living costs and Grace's education. And this condition feels like William is reaching from beyond the grave to control how she lives her life and whether she can escape the profession that has been slowly breaking her body and spirit for 12 years. The third condition is the one that makes Rachel's stomach drop, the one that transforms William's gift from generous to manipulative, and it requires that Rachel establish a foundation using $1 million of the inheritance to provide interest-free loans to families struggling with medical debt, and that she personally oversee this foundation for a minimum of 10 years, ensuring that the money is distributed according to criteria that prioritize families with children who are at risk of losing educational opportunities due to medical bankruptcy. This condition is not unreasonable in principle, but it requires time and energy and expertise that Rachel does not have. Requires her to become something other than a nurse, working double shifts to survive. Requires her to transform into someone who manages charitable organizations and makes decisions about who deserves help and who does not. And she does not know if she is capable of this transformation, or if accepting it would mean losing herself to William's vision of who she should be. The final condition is perhaps the strangest and most invasive, and it requires that Rachel meet with William's attorney every 6 months for progress reviews to ensure she is complying with the terms. And if the attorney determines that Rachel is using the money in ways that violate the spirit of William's intentions, even if not the letter of the contract, the attorney has the authority to revoke the inheritance and transfer it to predetermined charities. This condition means that Rachel's use of the money will be monitored and judged indefinitely, that she will never have the freedom that wealth is supposed to provide, that William's generosity is actually a form of control that extends beyond his death and transforms her into a steward of his values, rather than an independent beneficiary of his fortune. Rachel sits on her bed, holding the contract and feeling the walls of her small bedroom pressing in as she realizes that accepting this inheritance means accepting obligations that will define the rest of her life. That saying yes to $4 million means saying yes to becoming the person William wanted her to be, rather than discovering who she might become if she had resources without restrictions. She thinks about refusing the inheritance, about telling William's attorney that she cannot accept these conditions, about continuing to work double shifts and struggle with debt, and hope that Grace's intelligence and determination will somehow be enough to create opportunities that money usually guards. But she also thinks about the alternative, which is accepting the conditions and having security, even if that security comes with strings attached that feel more like chains. She does not tell Grace about the inheritance yet, because explaining it would require explaining the conditions and the theft that was not theft, and the dying man who orchestrated a test of her character that she apparently passed, even though she feels like she failed by taking something that was not offered until after she had already taken it. Instead, she goes to work at Mercy View and performs her duties with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose mind is occupied elsewhere, and she avoids William's room, which has already been cleaned and prepared for the next patient, because nursing homes cannot afford sentiment when there are always more dying people than available beds. During her lunch break, Rachel calls the number on the business card that William left in the envelope, and the attorney who answers identifies himself as Patrick Morrison and speaks with the measured formality of someone who has spent decades navigating complicated estate situations. And he tells Rachel that he has been expecting her call, and that William spoke highly of her and believed she was exactly the kind of person who should be entrusted with his fortune. Rachel tells Patrick that she has read the contract and has concerns about the conditions. And Patrick tells her that he understands her hesitation, but that the conditions are not negotiable. That William was very specific about wanting his money to serve purposes beyond simply making Rachel comfortable. That accepting the inheritance means accepting the responsibility to use wealth in ways that create positive impact rather than simply consuming it. Rachel asks Patrick what happens if she refuses the inheritance, and Patrick tells her that the money would go to a list of charities that William designated as backups, organizations that work with homeless families and medical debt relief and educational equity. And Rachel feels the unfairness of this arrangement, because either she accepts conditions that will control her life, or the money goes to strangers when she is the one who cared for William during his final months. Patrick seems to sense her frustration and tells her that she has 30 days to decide, that she should take time to think about whether the conditions are truly burdensome, or whether they are actually asking her to do things she would want to do anyway if she had resources. That perhaps William understood her better than she understands herself and structured the inheritance to protect her from the corruption that sudden wealth can create. If this manipulation disguised as generosity has made you angry, if the idea that even charity comes with control has stirred something in you, Leave the scales of justice emoji in the comments right now, because what Rachel discovers next will reveal that William's conditions are more complicated than they appear. Rachel spends the next week researching what it would take to establish a charitable foundation, and she learns that the process is complex and expensive and requires legal expertise and accounting systems and insurance and a level of bureaucratic navigation that feels overwhelming when she is already exhausted from working and parenting and managing the constant low-level crisis of near poverty. She learns that foundations require boards of directors and mission statements and grant application processes and annual reporting to the IRS. And she realizes that accepting William's inheritance means essentially taking on a second full-time job that she is completely unqualified for and that will consume time she does not have. She also learns that medical debt is a massive problem in America, that millions of families are one illness away from bankruptcy, that the healthcare system is designed in ways that extract maximum profit from human suffering. And she thinks about her own mother who died with $200,000 in medical bills that Rachel is still paying off in small monthly installments that barely cover the interest. She thinks about whether establishing a foundation to help families avoid this fate would be meaningful work, or just another way that William is controlling her from beyond the grave. And she does not have clear answers, because her anger at being manipulated wars with her recognition that the manipulation is designed to create good in the world. During this week, Grace notices that Rachel is distracted and asks multiple times if something is wrong. And Rachel keeps deflecting because she does not know how to explain that they might be millionaires. But only if Rachel agrees to spend the next decade of her life fulfilling a dead man's vision of how wealth should be used. Finally, Grace pushes hard enough that Rachel tells her a simplified version of the situation, tells her that a patient left the money, but that accepting it comes with conditions about how the money can be used. And Grace asks what kind of conditions, with the practical curiosity of a teenager who has learned that nothing in life is free. Rachel explains about the education requirement and the nursing requirement and the foundation requirement, and Grace is quiet for a long time before saying that it sounds like the patient wanted to make sure the money helped people beyond just their family. That maybe he understood that having money without purpose is empty. And Rachel feels surprised by her daughter's maturity and also defensive, because Grace does not understand how exhausting it is to work as a nurse or how limited Rachel's energy already is without adding the burden of managing a charitable organization. Grace tells her mother that she should accept the inheritance, that 5 more years of nursing is not that long when it means Rachel can stop working double shifts and can actually have weekends off. That having money for college means Grace can focus on studying instead of worrying about debt. That helping other families avoid medical bankruptcy sounds like exactly the kind of thing her grandmother would have wanted someone to do. Rachel listens to her 14-year-old daughter articulate arguments that are more sophisticated than her own circular reasoning has produced. And she realizes that Grace is right, but also that being right does not make the conditions less controlling, does not make William's posthumous management of Rachel's life less invasive, does not change the fact that accepting this money means giving up autonomy in exchange for security. She tells Grace she will think about it and Grace tells her that she already knows what decision she's going to make, because people do not turn down $4 million over pride. And Rachel wants to argue, but knows that Grace is probably correct, that she will eventually accept, because refusing would be choosing principle over practicality in ways that her daughter would pay for. The following week, Rachel meets with Patrick Morrison in his office, which occupies the 15th floor of a downtown building with views of the city and furniture that costs more than Rachel's annual salary. And Patrick greets her with professional warmth and offers her coffee that comes from a machine that probably costs more than her car. They sit in leather chairs that are more comfortable than Rachel's bed, and Patrick tells her that he needs to explain some additional details about William's life that will provide context for why the inheritance is structured the way it is. And Rachel settles in with the growing certainty that whatever Patrick is about to tell her will complicate an already complicated situation. Patrick tells her that William Harrington was not always wealthy, that he grew up in poverty in rural Virginia with parents who worked multiple jobs and still could not always afford to keep the electricity on, that he paid for college with scholarships and loans, and worked construction during summers to cover living expenses. Patrick tells her that William built his real estate fortune through intelligence and work ethic and some calculated risks that paid off, but that the wealth came at a cost because the long hours and intense focus required to build a company meant neglecting relationships and missing his children's milestones, and slowly becoming someone whose life was defined by acquisition rather than connection. Patrick tells her that William's wife left him after 20 years of marriage because she could not compete with his ambition, that his 2 children are estranged and have not spoken to him in over a decade, that he spent the final years of his life in a nursing home because he had money for care, but nobody who cared enough to provide it themselves. Patrick tells Rachel that William spent those final years in mercy, thinking about his choices and his regrets, thinking about how wealth without family is meaningless, thinking about whether his life had amounted to anything beyond the accumulation of money that he could not take with him when he died. Patrick tells her that William watched Rachel with her patience and saw someone who worked hard but maintained relationships, who was exhausted but still kind, who was poor but rich in the things that actually matter, and he wanted to give her wealth in ways that would not corrupt her the way it had corrupted him. Patrick tells her that the conditions in the inheritance are not about control but about protection, are William's attempt to ensure that Rachel does not make the same mistakes he made, that she does not sacrifice Grace's childhood for wealth, that she does not become someone who has money but has lost everything, that makes money worthwhile. Rachel listens to all of this and feels her anger at William's conditions softening, because she understands now that they come from regret rather than arrogance, come from a man who spent his final months watching someone live better with less and wanting to give her more without destroying what made her better. Patrick tells her that William wrote a second letter that he wanted Rachel to read only after she had time to think about the conditions, and he hands her an envelope that has her name written in the same shaky handwriting as the first letter, and Rachel opens it with hands that are steadier now, because she is beginning to understand that William's gift is more complicated than money and more valuable than dollars can measure, The second letter is longer and more personal than the first, and it explains that William chose Rachel not randomly, but deliberately after months of observation, that he saw in her the qualities he had lost in his pursuit of wealth, that he structured the inheritance to preserve those qualities while providing resources. The letter explains that the nursing requirement is designed to keep Rachel grounded in work that connects her to human suffering and prevents her from becoming isolated by wealth, that the foundation requirement is designed to ensure she understands that money is a tool for creating good rather than an end in itself, that the monitoring requirement is designed to provide accountability because accountability prevents the slow corruption that happens when wealth removes all constraints. The letter tells Rachel that she is free to refuse these conditions if they feel too burdensome, but that William hoped she would accept them, and in doing so become a living demonstration that wealth and character are not mutually exclusive, that it is possible to have money without losing your humanity. The letter ends with William telling Rachel that he watched her give extra time to confused patients and cover shifts for colleagues who had emergencies and bring homemade cookies for the staff Christmas party even. Though homemade cookies cost money, she did not have. And these small acts of generosity in the context of her own scarcity revealed character that he wanted to reward and preserve. He tells her that the ring was a test, but not in the way she probably thinks. That he wanted to see if she would take it, because taking it meant she valued her daughter's future more than abstract rules about property. That her willingness to cross ethical lines for Grace proved she understood that family matters more than principles. And this understanding is exactly what he wanted to support with his fortune. He tells her that he hopes she forgives him for the manipulation and accepts that his intentions were good, even if his methods were questionable. And he signs the letter with the simple instruction to use the money well and to remember him occasionally when she is helping families avoid the medical debt that destroys the futures. Rachel reads the letter 3 times, and each reading makes her understand William's conditions differently, makes her see them less as restrictions and more as guidance from someone who learned hard lessons and wants to help her avoid similar mistakes. She tells Patrick that she will accept the inheritance and will fulfill the conditions to the best of her ability. And Patrick tells her that he is glad because William believed in her and would have been disappointed if she refused out of pride or resentment. Patrick explains the next steps, which include signing the contract and establishing the foundation and setting up the educational trust for Grace. And he tells her that he will help with the bureaucratic requirements because William left funds specifically to cover the administrative costs of setting up these structures. Over the next month, Rachel's life transforms in ways that are both liberating and constraining, and she reduces her hours at Mercy, view from 60 per week to 40, because the inheritance conditions allow her to use some money for basic living expenses, which means she no longer needs double shifts to cover rent and groceries. She establishes the Bennett Family Medical Relief Foundation with Patrick's help and hires a part-time administrator who has experience with non-profit management. And she spends her newly available time learning about grant processes and donor management and the mechanics of charitable giving. She opens a college savings account for Grace and deposits enough money that Grace can attend any school she gets into without worrying about debt. And she watches her daughter's face transform from anxious determination to genuine excitement about future possibilities. She also starts seeing a therapist because suddenly having time and money for therapy reveals that she has been carrying trauma and stress and unprocessed grief that she suppressed while focused on survival. And the therapist helps her understand that accepting help, even with conditions attached, is not weakness, but rather wisdom. That William's inheritance is giving her the space to heal in ways that constant financial crisis prevented. She tells the therapist about the guilt she feels about taking the ring and the confusion she feels about whether William's gift is generous or controlling. And the therapist helps her see that both things can be true simultaneously. That complexity is normal when dealing with wealth and family and the obligations we have to people who help us. 3 months after William's death, Rachel holds the first grant review session for the foundation, and she sits with the administrator and Patrick and reviews applications from families who are drowning in medical debt. And she reads stories that sound exactly like her mother's story. Stories about cancer and car accidents and premature babies who required months in the NICU. Stories about insurance that covered some but not enough, and bills that accumulated faster than income could address them. Rachel approves grants for 12 families in that first session, and she writes checks totaling $50,000 that will prevent bankruptcies and foreclosures and the kind of desperation that makes people compromise their ethics. And she thinks about how William's money is creating ripples that extend far beyond her own family. She also thinks about William's children who are estranged and have not contacted Patrick about their father's estate, who apparently do not know or do not care that their father died and left his fortune to a nurse instead of to them. And Rachel feels strange guilt about this because she has taken what might have been their inheritance. Patrick tells her not to feel guilty because William's children made their choices, and those choices had consequences. That they could have visited their father, or called him, or sent cards acknowledging his existence. And their refusal to do any of those things meant they lost the right to his wealth. Patrick tells her that William's will included a letter to his children explaining his decision. A letter that detailed his disappointment in their unwillingness to forgive him for his mistakes and his hope that Rachel would use his money better than they would have used it. Rachel asks Patrick if she can read that letter, and Patrick tells her it is confidential, but he tells her the general content, which is that William apologized to his children for prioritizing work over family and asked them to understand that his choices came from his own childhood poverty and his desperate need to ensure they never experienced the hunger and uncertainty he remembered. The letter apparently explained that he left his money to Rachel because she demonstrated the values he wished his children had demonstrated, that she showed compassion and generosity despite having little, while they showed entitlement and resentment despite having much, and that his final act was to invest in someone who would use wealth to create good rather than simply consume it. 6 months after accepting the inheritance, Rachel has her first progress review with Patrick, and she brings documentation showing that she has reduced her nursing hours but remained employed. that Grace's college fund is established and growing, that the foundation has distributed $200,000 to 38 families, and that she has been attending therapy and using some money for basic quality of life improvements, like a reliable car and an apartment in a better neighborhood. Patrick reviews everything and tells her that William would be proud, that she is using the money exactly as he hoped, that she has maintained her character while improving her circumstances. And Patrick signs the 6-month compliance certification that confirms her inheritance is secure. But then Patrick tells her there is one more thing that William wanted her to know, one final piece of information that he instructed Patrick to reveal only after 6 months of successful compliance with the conditions. And Rachel feels apprehension rising because she has learned that every revelation about William's life comes with complications. Patrick tells her that William's ring, the one Rachel took and sold to the pawn shop for $8,000, was not worth $50,000 as she assumed, but was actually worth approximately $400,000 because the diamond was a rare pink diamond that collectors pay premium prices for. And the pawn shop owner, who gave her $8,000, knew exactly what he was buying and immediately sold it to a private collector for $375,000. Patrick tells her that William knew the ring's true value, that he knew Rachel would not know and would likely sell it for far less than it was worth, that this was part of his test because he wanted to see if she would steal and how she would handle the guilt and whether she would use the inadequate money wisely or squander it. Patrick tells her that William left instructions in his will that if Rachel passed his character test, she should be told about the ring's true value, not to make her feel bad, but to teach her that desperation makes us vulnerable to exploitation, that people in poverty are constantly taken advantage of by those who have more knowledge and more power, that the pawn shop owner stealing $367,000 from her through information asymmetry is exactly the kind of injustice that the foundation is designed to address. Rachel listens to this and feels anger and humiliation rising because even William's generosity contains lessons that feel condescending, contains teaching moments that position her as student and him as instructor, contains the implicit message that she needs to be educated about how the world works when she has been living in the world and understanding its injustices through experience rather than observation. But she also recognizes the accuracy of what Patrick is telling her, recognizes that the pawn shop owner did exploit her desperation and her ignorance, recognizes that this exploitation is exactly what happens to poor people constantly, in ways that keep them poor while making others rich. Patrick tells her that William wanted her to understand this so that when she reviews foundation grant applications, and when she makes decisions about who to help and how much to give, she remembers that the families she is helping are surrounded by predators who will exploit any vulnerability, that medical debt creates desperation that makes people easy targets for payday lenders and pawn shops, and rent-to-own schemes that extract wealth from those who have the least. Patrick tells her that William's conditions are not about controlling her, but about equipping her to use wealth as a tool for addressing systemic injustice rather than just addressing individual hardship. Rachel sits in Patrick's office and thinks about everything that has happened in the 6 months since William died, thinks about how her life has transformed and how her understanding of wealth and poverty and justice has become more complicated through having resources to distribute. She thinks about William, who died alone despite having millions, who spent his final months trying to create meaning through giving money to someone who showed him what character looks like when maintained despite hardship, who structured his gift to protect her from becoming what he became. And she thinks about whether she's grateful or resentful, or some combination of both. Whether William's posthumous management of her life is tyrannical or protective. Whether accepting help with conditions. Attached is compromise or wisdom. 3 years after William Harrington's death, Rachel sits in the community center where the Bennett Family Medical Relief Foundation holds its monthly grant review sessions, and the room is filled with volunteers and board members and families who have received help. And Rachel looks around at the space that has become something like a second home and thinks about how different her life is now from what it was when she stood beside William's bed and slid his ring off his finger with hands that shook from desperation and fear. The foundation has grown beyond what she imagined possible during those first overwhelming months, has distributed over $3 million to more than 200 families across the state, has prevented bankruptcies and foreclosures and the kind of financial catastrophe that destroys futures and breaks families in ways that take generations to repair. Rachel no longer works at Mercy View Nursing Home because the 5-year nursing requirement in William's will has been fulfilled, and she discovered during those 5 years that reducing her hours from 60 per week to 40 transformed nursing from something that was destroying her into something that was meaningful again. That having financial security allowed her to choose patients and shifts based on where she could do the most good, rather than based on which assignments paid the most. She worked those final years in hospice care because William's death taught her that dying with dignity requires someone who sees you as human, rather than as a collection of symptoms and insurance codes. And she brought to that work a presence and attention that came from understanding that how people spend their final days matters more than most of what happens during the years before. Grace is now 17 years old and preparing for college applications, and she has grown into someone who combines Rachel's work ethic with an idealism that has been nurtured by watching her mother run a foundation that helps families avoid the desperation they themselves once lived. Grace volunteers at the foundation on weekends, helping families navigate the application process and teaching financial literacy workshops for teenagers whose parents are struggling with medical debt. And Rachel watches her daughter transform other people's suffering into motivation for change, and thinks about how William's money has created possibilities that extend far beyond their own family. Grace wants to study public health policy because she has seen how systemic failures create individual tragedies, has watched her mother help families one at a time, and has decided that she wants to work on changing the systems that create the need for that help. And Rachel feels pride that is complicated by awareness, that Grace's opportunities come from a complicated gift that was part generosity and part manipulation. The foundation's work has evolved over 3 years, from simply distributing emergency grants to developing programs that address root causes of medical debt. And Rachel has learned to think like someone who manages resources rather than someone who simply survives. Has learned to ask questions about impact and sustainability rather than just responding to immediate need. The foundation now offers financial counseling to help families negotiate with hospitals and insurance companies. Runs workshops on navigating the healthcare system and understanding medical bills. Partners with local clinics to provide preventive care that reduces emergency room visits. And advocates for policy changes that would make medical debt less common and less devastating. Rachel has become someone who testifies at state legislative hearings and writes op-eds for local newspapers and speaks at conferences about the intersection of healthcare and poverty. And she sometimes cannot recognize herself in this person who has authority and influence when 3 years ago she was just a nurse stealing a ring because she could not see any other way forward. The transformation has not been easy or simple, and there have been moments when Rachel has resented William's conditions and felt controlled by requirements that dictate how she spends her time and her money. Moments when she has wanted to quit the foundation and use the remaining inheritance to simply live comfortably without the burden of helping others. Moments when the weight of other people's suffering has felt too heavy to carry when she is still processing her own trauma from years of poverty and her mother's death and the constant fear that one emergency would destroy everything. But during those moments, she has remembered William's second letter and his warning that wealth without purpose is empty, has remembered her mother who died under the weight of medical bills, has remembered the families whose stories sound exactly like her own story. Would have sounded if William had not given her a different ending. She has also discovered that the foundation work is meaningful in ways that nursing never was. That helping prevent suffering before it becomes catastrophic feels more impactful than managing suffering after it has already destroyed lives. That using money as a tool for systemic change creates ripples that extend further than individual acts of care. She has learned that she is good at this work, that her years of poverty taught her to understand how systems fail people, and her years of nursing taught her to navigate bureaucracy and advocate for patients. And these skills translate into running an organization that exists specifically to address the failures she experienced firsthand. She has built relationships with hospital administrators and insurance company representatives and local politicians, has learned to negotiate and persuade and apply pressure in ways that get policies changed and bills reduced and families protected. And she has discovered that power used well is not corrupting, but rather liberating in ways that money alone could never be. The community center, where the foundation meets, is in a neighborhood that Rachel knows well because it is 3 blocks from the apartment building where she lived when William died. And she chose this location deliberately because she wanted the foundation to serve the community that understood poverty from experience rather than theory, wanted families to access help without having to travel to downtown offices where they might feel intimidated or unwelcome. The center itself is a converted church with high ceilings and good natural light. And Rachel has filled it with comfortable chairs and children's books and a coffee station where families can help themselves while they wait for appointments. And she has tried to create a space that feels welcoming rather than institutional, that treats people with dignity rather than processing them as cases. Today's grant review session includes 5 families who have applied for assistance, and Rachel sits with her board members, who include a social worker and a hospital financial counselor and a woman who received a grant from the foundation 2 years ago and has since recovered financially and wanted to give back by helping evaluate applications. They review each case carefully, reading medical records and financial statements and personal essays that families submit explaining their circumstances. And Rachel has learned to look for patterns that indicate genuine need versus attempts to exploit the system. Has learned that desperation makes people sometimes exaggerate or omit information, but that these distortions come from fear rather than dishonesty. Has learned to extend grace, while also maintaining standards that ensure money goes to families who truly need it. The first family they review is a single mother with 2 children who was diagnosed with breast cancer and has exhausted her insurance coverage and is facing $140,000 in bills from surgery and chemotherapy and radiation. And Rachel reads the application and sees her own mother's story reflected in the details. Sees the same trajectory from diagnosis to treatment to debt to desperation. The board approves a grant of $50,000, which will not eliminate the debt but will prevent immediate bankruptcy and give the mother time to negotiate payment plans with the hospital. And Rachel signs the approval form and thinks about how this money comes from William, who died with regrets about wealth he accumulated but never used meaningfully. Thinks about how his final act was creating a mechanism for his money to continue, helping people long after he was gone. The second family is a couple whose premature twins spent 3 months in the NICU and survived, but created medical bills that exceed $400,000. And the father works construction and the mother works retail, and neither job provides adequate insurance, and they are facing foreclosure on the small house they bought 2 years before the twins were born. The board approves a grant of $75,000 plus connection to a legal aid organization that specializes in medical debt negotiation. And Rachel watches the relief on the parents' faces when she calls them to tell them the grant has been approved. Watches them cry with the kind of tears that come from having carried impossible weight and suddenly feeling it lifted. The third application is more complicated because it involves a family where the medical debt comes from addiction treatment rather than physical illness. And one board member expresses concern that funding addiction treatment sets a precedent that might attract applications from families whose problems are self-inflicted rather than purely circumstantial. Rachel feels herself getting angry at this distinction between deserving and undeserving suffering. Feels herself remembering all the times people suggested her mother's lung cancer was self-inflicted because she smoked. Feels herself thinking about how addiction is a disease that traps people in cycles they cannot escape without help that costs money they do not have. She tells the board member that the foundation does not distinguish between types of medical debt because all medical debt can destroy families. that addiction treatment is healthcare and deserves the same support as cancer treatment or premature birth care. And she uses her position as founder to override the objection and approve a grant of $30,000 that will allow a father of 3 to complete residential treatment without his family losing their housing. The 4th and 5th families receive grants as well, and by the end of the session, Rachel has approved $240,000 in assistance. And she thinks about how this amount represents nearly half of what the pawn shop owner stole from her when she sold William's ring for $8,000. Thinks about how the injustice of that theft has been transformed into justice for families who are experiencing similar exploitation by systems designed to extract maximum wealth from minimum power. She thinks about how William's conditions initially felt controlling, but have actually created structures that prevent her from becoming isolated by wealth, that keep her connected to the reality of suffering that money can address but cannot eliminate, that ensure his fortune serves purposes beyond her own comfort. After the session ends, Rachel drives to the cemetery where William is buried, something she does every few months, even though she never told anyone about these visits, because explaining them would require explaining feelings that are too complicated for simple language. William's grave is in a section of the cemetery reserved for people who purchase plots decades in advance. And his headstone is simple granite with his name and dates and no epitaph, because he told Patrick he did not want words that would sound hollow when nobody who knew him would visit to read them. Rachel brings flowers, which is a gesture that feels simultaneously appropriate and strange, because William was not family, and their relationship was professional until it became something else in his final weeks. But she brings them anyway because he gave her a future, and she wants to acknowledge that gift, even though the gift came with complications. She stands beside the grave and tells William about the Foundation's work, about the families they help today, about Grace's college applications and her plans to study public health policy, about the ways that his money has created ripples that extend far beyond what he probably imagined when he structured the inheritance. She tells him about the resentment she sometimes feels toward his conditions, about the moments when she wishes she could just be wealthy without the burden of using wealth responsibly, about the therapy sessions where she processes the guilt of having taken his ring and the confusion about whether his gift was generous or manipulative or both. She tells him that she has forgiven him for the test he put her through, for the manipulation disguised as generosity, for the conditions that control her life even 3 years after his death, because she understands now that he was trying to give her something more valuable than money, which was purpose and meaning and protection from the emptiness that consumed his own life. She also tells him about the pawn shop, about how she spent months being angry about the $367,000 that was stolen from her through her own desperation and ignorance, about how she eventually went back to that pawn shop and confronted the owner, who denied everything and claimed he gave her fair value and suggested that her accusations were slanderous. She tells William that she did not pursue legal action because Patrick explained that proving the owner knew the ring's true value would be nearly impossible, and that litigation would be expensive and emotionally draining. but that she has made peace with the loss because it taught her lessons about exploitation that make her better at running a foundation designed to prevent exploitation. She tells him that she has used the story of the ring in her public advocacy work, has written about how poverty creates vulnerability that predators exploit, has turned her personal experience of injustice into a teaching tool that helps other people understand systemic problems rather than just individual failures. Rachel leaves the cemetery as afternoon light is starting to slant into evening, and she drives through the city that has become familiar in new ways over the past 3 years. Drives past Mercy View, where she used to work double shifts, and past the apartment building where she lived when William died, and past the community center where the foundation operates. And she thinks about the geography of her transformation, about how the same physical spaces hold different meanings, now that her relationship to them has changed through having resources. She thinks about the families who live in those apartments and work at those nursing homes and bring their children to that community center. Thinks about how she is no longer one of them, but also cannot fully separate herself from them because 3 years of wealth has not erased 12 years of poverty or the understanding that comes from having lived on the edge where one emergency means catastrophe. She thinks about William's children who she has never met but who exist somewhere living their own lives, about whether they know their father left his fortune to a nurse instead of to them, about whether they care or whether their estrangement was complete enough that his death did not register as loss. Patrick told her once that William's daughter is a lawyer in Boston and his son works in finance in New York, that they are both successful and wealthy in their own right and probably do not need their father's money. But Rachel wonders whether need is the right framework for thinking about inheritance, whether William's children might have wanted something from their father beyond money, whether the letter he left explaining his decision provided them any closure or just created more bitterness. She wonders what she would do if one of them contacted her asking about their father's final months, asking what he was like before he died, asking whether he expressed regret about the estrangement or hope for reconciliation. And she thinks she would tell them the truth, which is that William was lonely and regretful and trying to create meaning through giving away money that he had accumulated instead of relationships. She would tell them that their father talked about them sometimes during the moments when his dementia lifted and his awareness returned, that he expressed sorrow about choices he made that prioritized work over family, that he wished he had been a different kind of father, but did not know how to repair damage that had accumulated over decades. She would tell them that he left his money to her not because she was better than them, but because she represented something he valued too late, because watching her work hard while maintaining relationships showed him what he had lost. Because his final act was trying to ensure his wealth served purposes he wished his own wealth had served. 5 years after William's death, Rachel receives a letter forwarded through Patrick's office, and the return address shows it is from someone named Jennifer Harrington in Boston, which Rachel recognizes as William's daughter's name. And she opens the envelope with apprehension because she does not know what William's daughter wants or why she is reaching out now after years of silence. The letter is handwritten on expensive stationery, and it begins with Jennifer introducing herself as William's estranged daughter and explaining that she recently learned about her father's death and the disposition of his estate. And she wants Rachel to know that she is not contesting the will or seeking any of the inheritance, but rather wanted to reach out because she has questions that only Rachel can answer. Jennifer writes that she and her brother received the letter their father left explaining his decision to leave his fortune to Rachel, that the letter expressed disappointment in their unwillingness to forgive him for his failures as a father, and praised Rachel for demonstrating values he wished they had demonstrated. Jennifer writes that reading this letter was painful because it confirmed her fear that her father died still, believing she was motivated by greed and entitlement rather than by hurt that came from having been neglected throughout her childhood, that his final act was choosing a stranger over his own children as one more way of communicating that they had failed to meet his standards. She writes that she wants to understand what kind of person Rachel is, that her father found her more worthy than his own daughter, wants to know whether Rachel manipulated a dying man or whether her father's assessment was accurate, that Rachel possessed qualities worth rewarding. Rachel reads this letter multiple times, trying to decide how to respond, trying to figure out what she owes to this woman who is William's daughter, but is also a stranger, trying to balance honesty about William's flaws with respect for Jennifer's complicated grief. She decides to respond with truth rather than comfort, and she writes back explaining that she did not manipulate William, but rather took his ring in a moment of desperation, that his gift was not reward for virtue, but rather an attempt to create meaning through giving money to someone who needed it, that she does not believe she was more worthy than Jennifer, but rather was present when William was searching for ways to address his regrets. She writes about William's loneliness and his recognition that wealth without family is empty, about his belief that Jennifer and her brother had lives that did not need his money, while Rachel had a life that did, about his hope that his fortune would be used to help families avoid the kind of suffering that poverty creates. She also writes about the conditions William attached to the inheritance, about the requirements that she work as a nurse and establish a foundation and submit to monitoring, about how these conditions revealed that William's gift was not unconditional generosity, but rather an attempt to control how his money was used even after his death. She writes that she has sometimes resented these conditions and sometimes appreciated them, that they have protected her from corruption, while also preventing her from having the freedom that wealth is supposed to provide, that William's final act was complicated and imperfect like most human acts. She writes that she does not know if she is using the money the way William hoped, does not know if the foundation is creating the impact he imagined, does not know if she has maintained her character or if wealth has changed her in subtle ways she cannot see, but that she is trying to honor his trust while also building a life that belongs to her rather than to his vision. Jennifer responds 2 weeks later with a letter that is shorter and more emotional, and she thanks Rachel for her honesty and tells her that reading about the conditions her father attached to the inheritance helped her understand that William's gift to Rachel was not simple preference, but rather complicated attempt at redemption. She writes that knowing her father died trying to create meaning makes his death feel less like rejection and more like the sad ending of someone who learned important lessons too late. repair his own relationships. She writes that she does not forgive her father for his failures, but that she is glad his money is being used to help families. That reading about the Foundation's work on their website made her cry because it represents the kind of purpose her father talked about, but never enacted during his life. She writes that she hopes Rachel continues the work despite its difficulties, that she should not feel guilty about having received an inheritance that Jennifer believes she has earned. Through maintaining integrity that wealth tests in ways poverty never does, the letters between Rachel and Jennifer continue sporadically over the next year, and they develop a relationship that is not friendship, but is something adjacent to it. A connection built on shared experience of William's complicated legacy and shared recognition that family is more complex than simple categories of deserving and undeserving allow. Jennifer eventually visits Rachel and the Foundation, and she volunteers for a grant review session and reads applications from families whose stories mirror what she knows about Rachel's past. And afterward, she tells Rachel that she understands now why her father chose Rachel. That reading those applications revealed a world Jennifer had been insulated from by wealth, and that seeing Rachel navigate that world with compassion and competence showed her what her father meant about character that is maintained despite hardship. Jennifer also tells Rachel that she has been thinking about her own wealth and how she uses it, that her father's death and his decision to leave his money to Rachel has made her question whether she is living purposefully or simply consuming resources. That watching the Foundation's work has made her want to do something similar with her own fortune. She asks Rachel for advice about establishing a foundation, and Rachel tells her about the bureaucracy and the difficulty and the emotional weight of constantly encountering suffering you can address but cannot eliminate. And she also tells her about the meaning that comes from using wealth as a tool rather than an end, about the satisfaction of seeing families avoid catastrophe because resources were available at the right moment. Jennifer leaves with plans to establish her own foundation focused on educational equity. And Rachel thinks about how William's complicated gift has created ripples that extend even to the daughter he believed had failed him, about how redemption sometimes arrives through unexpected paths and transforms people who were not the original targets of transformation. Grace graduates from high school and is accepted to multiple universities with full scholarships because her academic record is exceptional, and her personal essay about growing up in poverty and watching her mother transform desperation into purpose resonates with admissions committees, and she chooses to attend a public university with a strong public health program rather than the prestigious private schools that admitted her, because she tells Rachel that education is about learning to serve rather than about acquiring credentials. Rachel watches her daughter make this choice and feels pride that is complicated by awareness that Grace has internalized lessons about wealth and purpose that Rachel is still learning. That the next generation is already better at navigating these questions than Rachel may ever be. On the day Grace leaves for college, Rachel drives her to campus and helps her move into the dormitory. And as they unpack boxes, Rachel thinks about how different this moment is from what she imagined when Grace was born. And Rachel was working minimum wage jobs and living in apartments where the heat worked intermittently, and the future felt like something that happened to other people. She thinks about her mother who died before seeing Grace graduate high school, about how medical debt prevented Rachel's mother from living long enough to witness the opportunities that William's money has created, about whether her mother would approve of Rachel's choices or would criticize her for accepting help that came with strings attached. She thinks about William, who died alone in a nursing home, but whose final months were spent creating a mechanism for his wealth to serve purposes beyond his own comfort. But whether his life was wasted or whether his final act redeemed the years spent accumulating money instead of meaning. She thinks about the ring that started everything, about the moment she slid it off William's finger with hands that shook from desperation, about how that act of theft was actually the beginning of transformation that has defined the past 8 years of her life. She thinks about whether she would make the same choice again if she could go back to that moment. Whether knowing what she knows now about William's test and his conditions, and the weight of managing other people's suffering would make her refuse the ring and choose the certainty of poverty over the complexity of conditional wealth. She does not have clear answers to these questions because clarity requires simplicity, and her life has been anything but simple since William entered it. But she knows that she is grateful for Grace's opportunities and for the foundation's impact, and for having learned that wealth is a tool rather than a solution, that money can address problems but cannot eliminate the systems that create problems, that her work will never be finished because injustice is not a problem that can be solved, but rather a condition that must be constantly addressed through individual acts that accumulate into something larger than themselves. Rachel hugs Grace goodbye and drives back to the city alone. And she thinks about the evening ahead when she will go home to an apartment that is comfortable but not extravagant, will make dinner that is healthy but not expensive, will work on grant applications and foundation business, because the work never really stops, even though the urgency has changed. She thinks about William's grave, which she will probably visit again this weekend, about what she will tell him about Grace leaving for college and Jennifer establishing her own foundation, and the 300 families the Bennett Foundation has helped over 8 years. She thinks about whether he can hear her from wherever he is, or whether the visits are really for her own benefit, a way of processing gratitude and resentment and the complicated emotions that come from having been given a gift that changed everything while also controlling everything. She thinks about the pawn shop owner who stole $367,000 from her and who is probably still exploiting desperate people, about whether the foundation's work is revenge on a system that enabled that theft, or whether revenge is the wrong framework for thinking about justice, whether addressing systemic problems is about punishment or about prevention. She thinks about all the families who will face medical debt tomorrow and next month and next year, about how the foundation can help some, but not all, about how every grant approved means another family that could not be helped, about the impossible mathematics of need exceeding resources even when resources are measured in millions. And she thinks about the next grant review sessions scheduled for Thursday, about the applications already waiting to be read, about the stories that will sound like her own story and her mother's story and Grace's story if circumstances had been different, about the families who are living the life she used to live and who need help that she now has the power to provide. She thinks about how William's ring has been transformed through her hands, from symbol of wealth into mechanism for addressing poverty. About how theft became gift, became foundation, became purpose. About how the arc of her life has bent toward justice not through her own virtue but through accident and desperation and the complicated generosity of a dying man who was trying to redeem a wasted life through one final meaningful act. From 0 to 10, what score does this story deserve? Rate it in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if Rachel's journey from desperation to purpose resonated with something in your own life, if William's complicated redemption taught you that wealth without meaning is empty and that real inheritance is not money, but values that persist beyond death, then subscribe to this channel right now, because these are the stories that matter, the ones that remind us that character is tested not by poverty, but by how we use resources when we finally have them. That forgiveness is possible even when it is complicated, and that sometimes the people who hurt us are also the people who save us, if we are brave enough to accept help, even when that help comes with conditions that challenge everything we thought we wanted.